What is the book of 2 Corinthians about? I guess I would summarize the book of 2 Corinthians as Paul's vindication. He is defending himself and he is vindicating himself, and I think this will make sense if we understand that 2 Corinthians has basically three sections to it. The first is chapters 1 through 7, and Paul sort of begins that section by explaining to the Corinthians why he has not come to them. His critics were saying Paul's character is fickle. Paul says, my character is not fickle or inconsistent. I couldn't come to you because my trip to you was delayed by circumstances outside of my control. And then you get to about chapter 2 verse 13 through chapter 7 verse 3, verse 4, and that's called Paul's digression. He kind of goes off on a rabbit trail. And what had happened is he had given to the Corinthians a former letter that we call the severe letter, and he had no idea how they had reacted to that severe letter until Titus, who delivered that severe letter, showed up where Paul was at in Ephesus and told him how they reacted to it. And in the meantime, Paul had been kicked out of Ephesus. This will be on his third missionary journey, and he is kind of moving off into Macedonia, and he's waiting Titus's return trip from Corinth, taking the land route back. And the two of them aren't not going to get together until later, but in the interim, Paul is sort of not clear on how the Corinthians are going to react, so he's in a state of personal anxiety. And so it's in that section, chapters 2 through 7, that he articulates that God always leads us in triumph, no matter what our problems. And it's a tremendous section dealing with the man's ministry philosophy, why he was in ministry, why he continued to stay with the task, even though circumstances were difficult, what his motivations were in ministry. And then finally in chapter 7, he picks up what he left behind in chapter 2, and he gets word from Titus, some good news that the Corinthians had responded favorably to him. They had reacted positively to his severe letter, which isn't always the case in ministry. You don't know how people are going to react to correction. But the bad news is that there's a few ringleaders left that Paul sarcastically calls the super apostles, because they're claiming an apostolic authority even greater than Paul's, and they're still causing trouble within the church. And so Paul kind of wraps up that major section, chapters 1 through 7, by saying, don't be unequally yoked, which we usually apply to marriage, which is a legitimate application, but Paul is just saying remove yourself from those super apostles. And then that takes us into the second part of the book, chapters 8 and 9. Now that Paul has been vindicated in terms of his character, he can get down to the business of what he wanted to talk about when his character was under attack. It's something he hinted at the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 16, that he wanted to take up an offering for the struggling saints in Jerusalem. And it's hard to give money to an offering if people don't trust your character. But now that his character has been vindicated in the eyes of the Corinthians, he takes up the subject of this offering for the struggling saints in Jerusalem. And in chapters 8 and 9, which is the second major section of the book, he lays down the principles of grace giving. A lot of Christians, they don't understand how they're to give. They think we're under the tithing system from the Mosaic Law. We're not under that at all. We as church-age saints are not under the Mosaic Law. We're under a different set of regulations or principles called grace giving. And in chapters 8 and 9, he explains how to give. He uses a bunch of adverbs. Remember, an adverb modifies a verb. So these are things that modify the verb give. So we're to give hilariously. We're to give generously. We're to give joyfully. We're to give proportionately as God has prospered us. So if you want to know how to give, you don't put yourself under a numerical system, you put yourself under these adverbs described in chapters 8 and 9. And then finally, at the very end of the book, the third part of it, chapters 10 through 13, Paul addresses the so-called super apostles who are causing him trouble in Corinth, the ringleaders that really hadn't repented like the majority had. And he explains in that section how his apostleship is higher than their apostleship. He says, I'm a true apostle, they're just fake apostles. And he says, my suffering is superior to theirs. I perform signs and wonders superior to theirs. And one of the things he says, they think they have knowledge, I have more. And he describes in 2 Corinthians 12, verses 1 through 10, how he was actually taken into the third heaven. And he heard things that a man is not fit to hear. He knew things that no one else knew, and that's why God had to give him a thorn in the flesh to keep him humble in the midst of those circumstances. So that whole section, he's defending his apostleship to these against the super apostles in Corinth. And that's how the book ends. So the book of 2 Corinthians very quickly has three basic parts, 1 through 7, Paul's ministry and philosophy, mostly articulated before he got word of the good news from Titus, and then chapters 8 and 9, the offering project, and those are the principles of grace giving that we as church-age believers are under. And then chapters 10 through 13 is the supremacy of and the authority of Paul's apostleship in comparison to the super apostles. He makes a few parting remarks about his preparation to visit them, and he's preparing them for that. But it's a tremendous book. Most Christians know a ton about 1 Corinthians, but they know very little about 2 Corinthians. And so I hope you'll get into that book now that you've got this broad overview, and you'll enjoy it. God bless.